to make it clear.
Order. I did not make the comment.
Bill, it's not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Sure, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen 8, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight are my revolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers. Here's a former Green Party MP, well-known social justice activist and political commentator, Keith Locke. And she is from the Auckland University Department of Film, TV and Media Studies, one of the best bloggers in New Zealand, Phoebe Fletcher. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, Issue 1. Water everywhere, but not a drop for Māori. How has Key handled the clash with the Waitangi Tribunal? Issue 2. Will the latest revelations on the pokey deal at Sky City sink the Free Convention Centre? And Issue 3. Does Serco's failure last week at Mount Eden Prison prove how flawed public-private partnerships are? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off tonight with Issue 1. Fresh from his whirlwind tour of Australia to pimp asset sales to foreign investors, John Key walks back into a Waitangi Tribunal inquiry into who owns the water and manages to insult the entirety of Māoridom by shrugging the tribunal off. Phoebe, isn't it glib of the PM to claim no one owns the water when government regulates and administers water with all the power of ownership? I mean, John Key wasn't saying no one owns the water when his government took over ECAN, was he?
No, I think that's a very good point. I mean, what we did see was the government come in and swoop and take over environmental Canterbury over the dispute with the farmers and the waterways. So I think what we've got going on here is a very clear dog whistle attempt to appeal to the same kind of arguments around the foreshore and seabed, which, do strike a chord, I think, with some segments of the population that perhaps don't understand the legislation around this. So I think we've got a deliberate attempt here to obfuscate the issue.
Was Key particularly rude and as insulting as he was? Was that so that he calmed down possible investors who will be looking at this going, oh, we were keen, but now we're not so sure because there could be this legal issue? I mean, was that the reason or the rationale as to why he came down as hard as he did?
I think he is in between a rock and a hard place at the moment. We have had an economist come out this morning in the Herald and say that this may affect the share prices. But I think what it does reflect is a longer tension and, I guess, disregard for the Waitangi, Treaty of Waitangi among the National Party. I mean, we saw originally in the drafts over the sale of asset legislation that we saw Clause 9 over the Waitangi Tribunal taken out by accident. And at the time it was, trying to be positioned as a mistake. But I think you would have to argue that ideologically the National Party and the Māori Party are opposed on this issue.
Is this political mismanagement or were they aware of this?
Oh, I think you would have to be absolutely stupid to argue that they weren't aware of this potential clash all along. And I think it's, potentially a bigger issue than they think it is. I mean, because this is something that Tariana Turia, formed the Māori Party over. And while the Māori Party have been running that line of sitting at the table, they are going back to their people to consult. I mean, we saw them have 81 hui after the election. So I think this is a bigger issue than they expect that they are taking on. It'll be really interesting to see what happens with the Māori Council claim to the Waitangi Tribunal.
Keith, Helen Clark sold her confiscation of the foreshore and seabed as "their Maoris want to steal our beaches," and the conservative media pretty much went along with that narrative. But is this different because the majority of New Zealanders are looking for a handbrake to asset sales?
I think so. I think that's why you haven't seen the same sort of reaction to Māori and the almost total opposition to what Key has done in dismissing the Waitangi Tribunal, which is a tribunal. It does have some binding powers actually to transfer, under the State Enterprises Act, to transfer some of the set-aside land to Māori as a result of a settlement. And it's the intersection of sort of Pākehā law and Māori law. It's a very important body and shouldn't be dismissed lightly. And also there's a whole build-up of law and practice in relation to water, like the Waikato River. Well, technically under what was arranged there, Māori haven't been granted the ownership right of the Waikato, but they've been granted co-management and all but the ownership of the water or co-ownership of the water. So, and there's a whole lot of things like that going on around the country, and even under the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which the government finally signed, a UN declaration. This was under pressure from the Greens and the Māori Party, etc. It says explicitly in that there should be informed consent if governments use water that has a relation to an Indigenous claim. So, you know, I think John Key's boxed in, and most people would see that, yes, we want water to be used in the collective interest of us all, and if Maori collective interest and the collective interest of the whole nation can tie together to stop these assets being sold, and clearly the hydro assets, you know, major dams, have a big relation to how water is used in our society. So, you know, it's very useful what the Māori are doing.
Were you surprised that the Prime Minister was as dismissive of the Waitangi Tribunal as he was? I mean, was that a surprising language?
Yeah, well, he often shoots a bit from the lip, as some have said. And then once he's there, he sort of keeps going down that track. And I think he's got himself into a problem, because it does insult Māori, his ignorance on the matters and not understanding. If you're in a relationship with the Māori Party in government, then you should understand the Waitangi Tribunal, the issue, a bit more than he seems to do.
Is he adding insult to injury by not even finding time in his busy schedule to meet face to face with the Māori Party to actually discuss it? I mean, that's surely exceptionally rude, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think it's almost a repetition of history. Like Helen Clark was a bit dismissive of Tariana Turia, who was a minister in her government, over the foreshore and seabed, and then when the Hikoi came to Parliament, she was dismissive of that. And John Key, you know, he should have learned from that, and a bit of a problem here, let's at least be nice. But he seems to have missed the boat a bit.
I mean, it's interesting because we saw on Campbell Live the other night as well, him call John Campbell financially illiterate. So he seems to have a little bit of a shorter temper.
Yes, he's not so smiley and wavy, is he? Phoebe, if Key gives Māoridom a sweetener to settle this, he risks rebellion from his own rump vote, but if it goes to court, it could sink the first asset sale, which National desperately need to work. Is he damned if he does, damned if he doesn't?
Yes, I think he is, and that was my point before, and Keith's point, I think, is that he is in between a rock and a hard place. As to whether Māori would accept another sweetener in exchange for those rights, I don't think that they would. I think that this is, you know, a massive issue within their constituencies, and we are seeing that even within the Māori Party, where you've had Peter Sharples and Tariana Turia seem to be coming out with completely different lines at the moment over the water rights issue. So I think while it might appeal to, you know, some national voters, I think he is in between a rock and a hard place on this one.
Keith, last month the Māori Council warned the newly formed Freshwater Iwi group not to play Māori off against Māori by cutting a side deal with the Crown. Will Michael Cullen's and Toku Morgan's new group cut a deal undermining Māori solidarity, and would such a deal cause backlash with national voters?
I think the Māori Council's got a point that everyone should get behind. It's a fairly broad claim, a number of dimensions to it, and run this out before scrambling around for some deal that might, you know, be of advantage to one section or another. I think
because you seem to
that
have
whole idea of the collective
the
collective interest of the nation. Sure, in the long term, there's got to be more of a plan for water and more resource pricing and all the rest of it. But that should be done on a collective basis involving the whole nation and Māori if they win this case.
Final question, both of you. How sustainable are the Māori Party's claims of it being beneficial to be at the table when Key is just writing the tribunal off? I mean, is that position the Māori Party use, is it tenable?
I don't think it is tenable in the long term, but we have seen the Māori Party on occasion actually go out on their own. So, for example, they backed the Greens farming
That's right.
bill. So
That's right, yeah.
I don't think it is sustainable in the long term for their voters, no.
Can they do this act in your
Well, I think it's wearing away at their vote, but I would judge them more on how they fight on the individual issues rather than whether they stay inside the tent, even though I'm critical of that.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2. Night after night, the 6 p.m. TVNZ News have had exclusive after exclusive detailing how shoddy and shonky the convention centre for pokies really is. Phoebe, does TVNZ deserve some kudos for not letting this issue lie? I mean, this is the type of journalism we need from the media, isn't it?
I think they do deserve kudos actually for their coverage of this issue, and I think, you know, we have seen them do some very good journalism, including sending a journalist in to see whether they were actually conforming to their own host responsibility policies, which, you know, as we saw, the journalist was not called up over anything, even not being able to pay the car parking fee. And I think that this is a very important issue that does need to be debated. I mean, what we have here is National Party policy that is pushing development at a large cost to people. So these are issues that do need to be investigated further.
And of course, it had to be investigated in the 6 p.m. news because, I mean, Mike Hoskins couldn't have done this on Close-Up, could he? Do we have a problem with high-flying broadcasters and high-profile broadcasters in New Zealand having special relationships with Sky City Casino?
I think we have a problem with a whole series of public figures having special relationships with Sky City Casino. I mean, it's pretty evident that the National Party obviously has a pretty special relationship with Sky City Casino. I mean, that's where they always have their election parties.
That's right.
You know, there are close relationships there, but obviously there is a conflict of interest that TVNZ could not run it.
I need to declare a conflict of interest. Sky City pay me to stay away from Sky City.
I think there's a real problem with Sky City and incorporating virtually all the celebrities and politicians. They have these functions all the time with often a charitable dimension, like they hosted the Fight for Life the other day, and they were a co-sponsor of it and all the rest of it. But you see on the celebrity pages of the newspapers all of these, including local and national politicians turning up. They bought tickets for 50 MPs to the World Cup, and 15 of them took their hospitality, including David Shearer, the Labour leader.
Yeah, that's right.
And when I go along and watch the Breakers, the basketball team, you know, when that really excited people, you're given in your pack these little balloons with Sky City on them, the Sky City person's on at half time, and you know, it's a whole promo for Sky City. And this is an institution who's obviously, if they're trying to increase their profits, the way they do it is get more people to gamble for longer. And one of the latest revelations is they've been sending texts out of people saying, come back, come back. Because that's the whole point. Sure, they say that we do something for people that get out of hand, although that's questionable, isn't it?
But they spent $15 million in 10 years. Shouldn't someone have said, oh, that's a bit out of hand? I mean, they didn't look at that, did they?
But I think politicians should stay away from this PR, like, you know, the private boxes at sports events and all this sort of stuff, because even if people say we're not influenced, and Mike Hoskins says I'm not influenced, in reality, if people are giving you things, you're just that little in your head, something works in your head, even subconsciously, and you're less critical of it.
And you self-censor, don't you?
Yeah.
So it turns out, Keith, that 42% of the pokie machines that John Key claims are being taken out of circulation so that the increase at Sky City will seem less of an impact, turn out to be pokie machines that were destroyed in Christchurch. It's hardly the planned actions of a government attempting to curb the dangers of gambling, is it?
Yes, well, Christchurch citizens are gambling at the moment with their insurance companies, I think. But and the thing about this replacement, we're taking some out of here and putting them in Sky City, is that Sky City runs 24/7.
Yes.
Whereas the pub pokies have a smaller, and apparently, you know, the pokie machines in Sky City, they used 140,000 times a year.
That's right.
And the ones in private hotels and that are used about a third as much.
That's right.
So
That was
TVNZ, Phoebe, showed that pokies are distributed into the areas of most deprivation, and Central Auckland is ranked as one of the most deprived. The claim that Sky City will only target overseas visitors, it just doesn't ring true, does it?
It absolutely does not ring true. I mean, let's be very clear here. This is a business that is aiming to generate profits. And I think we've seen this week also that Sky City is not interested in releasing their gambling studies that they've done on themselves until 2013. Okay, which, you know, as some experts have pointed out, that this might enable them to be able to target people to gamble for longer at a less dangerous level of risk. Well, you've got to look at the cumulative impact of spending that amount of money on pokies over time and argue that that is potentially destructive to our society. So I think here there is an issue. I mean, I am not against people having personal freedom to be able to do such things, but I think that when we have deals that are so closely tied to the government, I think that we really need to look very closely at the social cost of this.
Keith, just going back to that point you made about the gambling machines making $140,000 per year for Sky City.
They used 140,000 times, I think. Yeah.
The problem gambling people have worked out that 350 more machines is going to equate to $49 million per year to Sky City. When you look at it in those terms, that $350 million cost for the convention center, that's just a capital upfront cost to build a machine.
Yeah, and they're getting a return off the convention centre
That's right.
when it's built. You know, sure, some of these convention centres aren't fully profitable, but I'm sure Sky City has done its sums, and it's not going to lose a huge amount in operational costs.
It's hardly the generous act of a casino that cares about its city, is it?
No, it's just Sky City being very smart and fooling the government, trying to fool us, and of course fooling a lot of gamblers.
Final question to both of you. Is it demeaning? Is it demeaning to the position of Prime Minister to have John Key pimping for the gambling industry?
I think it is demeaning because we are in an economic environment which is really hitting some of our most underprivileged people, and we've got a casino that is targeting these people. So
is it demeaning to the position of Prime Minister?
Well, I think so. A, you shouldn't do it, but B, our Prime Minister going around and particularly to a gambling institution. That's one of the problems, that the institutions that wield the most influence in PR and over Prime Ministers and Ministers, etc., have historically been the tobacco industry, less so now, the liquor industry, which still does if you go to sports games and all the rest of it, and they've got a huge influence, and the gambling industry. And we shouldn't have our politicians sort of linked up with deals with any of those industries.
Should we be looking, is it time to start looking at a vice tax to go on the profits of those industries?
Well, yeah, the more they're taxed, but I think you want to have less people going into, particularly gambling, like some forms of, the Sky City claimed at one point that lotto was more harmful than the pokies. Well, that's just absurd, and everyone laughed like mad. But, you know, those really nasty forms of gambling, our whole focus should be on reducing. Pokies are not a good thing in New Zealand.
Right. Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3. Does Serco's failure last week at Mount Eden Prison prove how flawed public-private partnerships are? Phoebe, half the targets weren't met by Serco, and yet we are still building them a $1 billion 900-bed prison at Wiri. Bill English promised this year that this prison would cost 10% less than the public sector. Is the Finance Minister being optimistic? Is he being delusional? Or is he being optimistically delusional?
I think he's being optimistically delusional there.
Yes.
I mean, Serco have already paid $200,000 in fines for their inability to meet the performance parameters of the contract. And what we have seen overseas is that studies have shown that these private prisons don't necessarily cost the taxpayer less. And in fact, what we're seeing with Serco is we're seeing more violent assaults. And we have to ask ourselves, is this really the model of prisons that we want to have, which is privatised as people making profit off people being incarcerated?
Why is that a problem? I mean, some are going to say if it's cheaper, why not go down that path?
Well, I think the key aim of prison has to be rehabilitation. Obviously, that's not something that's possible in the case of every prisoner, but in terms of the long-term social effects, this is what we need to be looking at. And we need to be looking at things like, what are the prison guard to prisoner ratio? Are there enough people on there? And, you know, my worries are that by privatising and creating an incentive to get a profit, that, you know, there's going to be more pressures on staff, and that these sorts of events are going to increase. And in fact, Serco just had a damaging report I believe it was in Scotland, you know, over their management of prisoners. So I think there are huge issues around this. That is something that needs to be looked into further, and I don't know whether we should be proceeding with the prison at Wirral so quickly.
Keith, is the most disturbing thing here that this private prison is no longer under the scrutiny of the Ombudsman? I mean, here we have citizens incarcerated, that's the direct responsibility of the state, but this company's not actually, it doesn't have to be scrutinised at all by any of those bodies.
Yes, no, that's very worrying, and particularly as Phoebe has said, rehabilitation is absolutely key. If you're talking about a drain on the public purse and public safety, then preventing reoffending is the key thing. And if you've got a private prison, it wants to cut corners all the time, and at the moment it seems to be that is 20 only for prisoners, convicted prisoners who have been in that prison, the Mount Eden ones, for 28 days, only 28% of them had a program worked out for them. So there's a slowness there, and obviously if you're trying to make a profit with a private prison, you cut down on the person hours. And a lot of the rehabilitation involves, you know, pretty heavy one-to-one or small group sort of stuff. Not just formally they've got a program to learn to read or whatever, which very good though that will be. But you're going to, a private prison is always going to cut the corners. The private prison is not going to say, well, if I give this prisoner an extra 20 hours of time on the course, on reading, on whatever the person might be interested in, then that person is less likely to reoffend within the next 4 years after they get out, because that's nothing to do with their bottom line. Their bottom line is just person hours and trying to reduce those. So,
when this prison is built, we will have, this is based on the figures that corrections have given, we will have 4,000 spare beds in the current prison setup. Why are we building another 1,000 bed prison when we will have, by the time it's completed, 4,000 free beds?
Yes, we shouldn't be doing that at all. And in fact, if we rehabilitate people, you know, the prison population is going to keep going down, and that's the most cost-effective way to go. It's sort of a real indictment on both Labor and National that over the past the period I was in Parliament, 12 years I was in Parliament, was just a battle between Labor and National to see who could extend the sentences the most and be the toughest and all the rest of it. And then they wake up, and even National wakes up and says, hold on, why have we got all these people in prison, 8,000 more?
One of the highest prison incarceration rates in the population.
And that is a direct result of bending to this law and order thing, rather than seeing prisoners and people who commit crimes as being capable of rehabilitation, looking at the causes of the crime and trying to deal with them, trying to deal with the poverty.
How culpable do you think the mainstream media are when it comes to feeding that anger in the public? I mean, if you were looking at the New Zealand Herald over the last week, it's just been crime story, crime story, crime story that's been leading. Gory details, the worst elements of our nature, constantly used to make ratings and sell newspapers. How much of the culpability do they need to take in terms of fanning that get tough on crime crap?
Yeah, well, you do get very few rehabilitation stories.
No, that's
there
right.
was one which I was very pleased on television a week or two back on a chap who's, you know, a top musician who's sort of rehabilitated himself. I thought, well, that's one good one, but it was one in a sea of all these evil prisoners and so-and-so's guilty and so-and-so should be locked up and so-and-so should never be let out of prison and they shouldn't be let out on parole, etc. And the victim's family. What annoys me is the victim or the victim's family is interviewed all the time, and of course it's predictable that 90% of the time they're angry and they're hurting. And then the audience is supposed to react and think, oh, the bastard. And
well, I mean, there's been studies done on this in New Zealand in terms of the predominance of crime in the news. And what this actually comes down to is media economics. So if we've got a situation where we're cutting back on journalists, where people are under pressure to reach deadlines, crime news becomes easy news. You know, it becomes, it fits all those kind of categories of, you know, being able to do live crosses, you know, as we saw even with the balloon incident in Featherston, where you had both news channels basically sending all of their staff to Featherston to do live cross after live cross of the hearse going past and so on. So this is, very much about journalists not having the time to be able to do investigative stories. That these investigative stories are the politics that make our nation.
And the other thing is, like, TV is more based on emotion. How do we get an emotional attachment of the viewer to our news program? And they've got a choice in crime stories between two types of emotion. One, an empathy emotion with the criminal as well, saying, well, why did this kid do it and how can we help this kid? That's an empathetic emotion. The other emotion is, what a bastard, evil, get them, lock them up, never let them go. And TV is more consciously now adapting to that lack of empathy emotion. In fact, the very opposite.
Thank you, panel. We'll wrap the show now with final thought. Phoebe, your final thought this week?
My final thought is the 75 agencies, I believe it is, that have come out in concern over the government's green paper on vulnerable children. They are concerned that this is only applying to the 15% that are the most vulnerable children, whereas they say agencies including UNICEF that this should apply broadly to children. I think that this is an area that needs to be looked at further, and I think this is of high concern.
Keith, your final word this week?
Well, I was worried that the government seems to be hailing New Zealand Rail for saying it's going to save $200 million over 3 years by laying off 220 workers, when clearly the tracks around the country still need a hell of a lot of work. We should be employing people rather than laying them off. Because, the train between Auckland and Wellington, for example, I think it takes longer than it used to about 30 years ago because the track's deteriorated. There's a huge amount of work to be done on the track north of Auckland and obviously the Gisborne Railway, etc., etc. They shouldn't be laying off workers if we're to have a 21st century rail system.
Kiwi Rail going to be sold?
I'm not sure that anyone would really want to buy it, because everything's run down so much. They might have that intention, but whether they could actually do it, I'm not sure.
Lovely. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Phoebe. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word. Let's be clear for the talkback listeners amongst us. This Waitangi Tribunal issue is not a case of Mary taking the water. This legal challenge by Māori has been brought on by the state's desire to sell off a public asset. Things gifted to the Crown by Māori for the public good cannot then be sold to private interest without Māori becoming involved. That is what happened when the Marlborough Council were arrogant enough to force the issue by selling title to glorified boat houses, which sparked the foreshore and seabed confiscation. That is what is happening now. I predict some insanely draconian policy idea aimed at beneficiaries being quickly cooked up to desperately divert attention. Perhaps the firstborn male of each solo mother being sacrificed for Milton Friedman alongside a cautiously optimistic editorial from the New Zealand Herald backing it up. I digress. Keys needs to make the first asset sale work means he's cutting corners and arrogantly disrespecting institutions that are deeply regarded. If he cuts a sweetener for the freshwater iwi, his own voter base will rebel. If he pushes on regardless, it will end up in the High Court and sour the sale. Such a political dilemma couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded news citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Don't forget my new show, The Union Report, plays 8 p.m. Monday nights here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.